As you mentioned, my name is Sean Wallis. I'm with Colonial South Events. I work in event coordination for reenactments, historical consultation, and costuming in film and television. Worked on a lot of stuff in my time. Very first movie, I'm the shortest redcoat in the battalion in the Patriot. Worked on AMC's Turn, Washington Spies, and most recently, can't do much work in America thanks to the strike right now, but I managed to get some work in on Napoleon, Ridley Scott's film coming out next month, so get a chance, go see it. Ken and Paul pretty well thoroughly covered a lot of the political background and climate of the era leading up to the Stamp Act crisis and the subsequent revolution. These really are not separate events. These are inextricably linked and directly lead to the next series of revolution. The Carolinas were central, as was mentioned and pointed out. North Carolina, in particular, with the Stamp Act crisis and Governor Tryon's response, led to the seeds that were planted that created the Regulators' Revolt in 1771, another war for liberty and independence preceding another revolt, as Ken put it, differentiating a revolt and a revolution preceding our successful revolution concluding in 1783. We won't go too much more into the political background. I feel like you guys have got some pretty solid context on that at this point. I represent your general middling class of Charlestown, a trader, immigrant of German and English heritage, probably served at some point in either the Prussian military or the German army, or the English army. Would be familiar with the drill from that case, but as a social climber, not necessarily someone from an aristocratic background, as comprised the majority of the officer classes in the British Army, the militia system that would form the core of what would go on to be the Continental Army during the Revolution proper was already well in place. It was in place even before the French and Indian War, was very thoroughly utilized during that conflict. In fact, that's one of the things that the Stamp Act was going to pay back, essentially. Equipment, uniforms, muskets were coming imported from Britain and in some cases from the Netherlands for these militia systems as they were put in place. Essentially, every member of the local community, usually broken down by counties, would be required to serve in the militia. Basically, your weekend warrior, the predecessor of today's National Guards. If you're between the ages of 14 and 60 and you had a minimum of 2 oppositional teeth, that means 1 tooth on top, 1 tooth on bottom, so that you can bite the paper cartridge and open it up and load your weapon. This was a physical requirement to serve. This was also a social club in a way. The more prominent your county, the more prominent your members of your local militia, the more in vogue it was to join that militia. It's not unlike many fraternities that humans have developed, particularly throughout the 18th and 19th century that even carry on today. Some units are more popular and in vogue than others. The Charlestown Battalion of Artillery was exceptionally popular militia for your most well-to-do traders. Everyone wanted to be part of that group, and were able to establish greater social connections, trade, politics, religion, every aspect of life represented in these groups, because everyone had to pitch in to form this self-defensive system. This offset costs in terms of a professional standing army, which was a relatively new concept in the 18th century. They've been around here and there in some form in some nations for a couple of centuries at this point, but still very spread out. Prussia is one of the major pioneers, would go on to unite Germany in 1871. They were one of the major pioneers of the standing, professional, trained, well-drilled and disciplined standing European army of the time. So much so that the Prussian drill, as it was colloquially known, was adapted into most European militaries of the time. The French style of coat was worn by the Prussians and in turn by the English, as we see on our friends in the 33rd here. Being a civilian militia, I'm just wearing my clothes. It's summer, so I'm wearing, or it still feels like summer. It's not, but I'm wearing linen primarily. Just for the background of my kit, I've got my old Von Hune regimental waistcoat from back when my Germanic persona would have potentially served in a Prussian unit back overseas. And I've retained the British Longland pattern Brown Bess musket. By the time of the Revolution, you would probably be seeing more second pattern Shortland Brown Besses in the hands of the professional soldiers, in particular a unit like the 33rd, who was very well known for getting the best of equipment. I'll let 33rd talk a little bit more about the material culture on British units, but each regiment was raised and paid for and funded by the colonel of that regiment. The 33rd, I'm sure they'll mention, was Cornwallis's own, and General Lord Cornwallis, being a commander during the Revolution of the Southern Campaign, took great pride in having his personal unit looking tip-top. So that's why these gents look as fine as they do. The militia, more ad hoc. Some militias would have uniforms, and this would go on to be the basis of the Continental Blue. Many of the militia uniforms were blue-faced red during the French and Indian conflict. By this period, that still exists in some areas. We're largely phasing out and/or moving to just using hunting frocks or civilian clothes. In a township militia, in a urban area like Charleston, you're more likely to see someone not in a hunting frock, but in their township clothing. They would get together one weekend a month, practice the 1768 Manual of Arms, the very same drill that the British regulars would practice. And the primary technology for warfare at the time, of course, artillery was the king of combat. We'll get there. We'll let Kingsbury tell you all about artillery. But in the hands of your everyday infantrymen, infantry being the core of every army, your smoothbore musket was the high tech of the day. The rifle did exist in this period, and the primary differentiation between a musket and a rifle is the fact that a musket is smoothbore and a rifle is rifled. Rifling, for those who are not aware, are actual physical grooves spirally carved on the interior surface of the barrel, which then imparts a lateral spin on the projectile, stabilizing it in flight. Makes it more accurate, makes it fly further, straighter, less drop. This is why the German Jaegers and the American riflemen, particularly the Pennsylvania and the later Kentucky rifle, which was adapted from the German Jaeger rifle, were so feared during the War for Independence. They were far outranging the effective range of the musket. Now, that is not to say one is superior to the other, especially given the technology of our ignition systems at the time. This is meant to be fired en masse, in volleys, shoulder to shoulder, rank and file, with at least a few dozen to ideally a few hundred or a few thousand other men next to you firing in sections. It's called the shotgun effect, firing in volleys. In fact, this is typically loaded with not just a single projectile, but a load known as buck and ball. So you have one big 69 caliber ball, that's really big, it's 1 ounce of lead, and usually a handful of smaller, as we call them today in a modern shotgun, buckshot following behind them. That increases the spread, makes it a little less of consequential that this weapon is not rifled. So almost anything at the other end is likely going to be hit by something. And that's the overall concept behind the mass volley firing in and of itself. You're not actually out to kill as many of your opponents as possible. 18th century linear warfare is more about applying pressure to the enemy than it is about inflicting casualties. We would see that change drastically with the improvement in ignition and rifling technology between the War for Independence and the American Civil War. For example, even though we see in the movies rank and file, a linear warfare lining up shoulder to shoulder and at basically muzzle distance across an open field at each other, that's more or less so they can get both armies in the frame of the shot. Most of these engagements took place at least 100 yards. which is pushing the effective range, almost the max effective range of these weapons. So you are trying to fight as far out as possible. So you are applying pressure en masse to another big block massed body of men and trying to inflict pressure, force them to move back and take the field. When you're exchanging volleys, you might see maybe 1 in 10 men on either side going down. Now, by the time of the improvement in technology of the ignition system by the American Civil War, we go from the flintlock system that we have seen here. This is the basis of any firearm. You have your lock, your stock, and your barrel. You might have heard that saying before, lock, stock, and barrel, that's what makes a gun. So this is a flintlock. So the flint is right here, that's your lock, your rock, as you might sometimes hear this called colloquially a rock lock. I don't like that. Your flint is held by a piece of leather, gripped in place by a vise called the cock. Now you might think that's called the hammer, because that's where the hammer is on a modern gun, but in fact, this is the hammer. This has been incorrectly referred to as the frizzen for a number of years, but we don't actually have any period references to it being called that. We only have this being referred to as the hammer, or hammer stall. So when this flint strikes this hammer, this flat, hardened piece of steel, now we're going to just make sure we're good and empty.
Okay.
When this flint strikes this hard piece of steel, see that? You get a nice little spark, a good, consistent spark. The sharper that flint, the cleaner your assembly is, the more consistent and reliable that spark is. So right there, below that hammer stall, we have a little divot known as the pan. This is your priming pan. And right next to the pan, you have a little hole known as your touch hole. And that hole goes right into the breech of the weapon. So when you load this weapon, you bite the top off. We'll do a full demonstration with the help of our friends from the 33rd in just a moment. You prime the weapon by pouring a little bit of powder into that pan. You shut that pan, cast the weapon about, pour the primary charge into the barrel, into the breech, through the muzzle. This is why they're referred to as muzzle loading weapons. You remove your ramrod, placing the paper from the charge itself, which would also contain your buck and ball. That paper then acts as your wadding, and you ram everything home, seat that at the base in the breech. Return your ramrod. You do not want to just dramatically throw away your ramrod after you load your weapon like Jason Isaacs does in the Patriot. You cannot reload the weapon after that. They might be one shot, but they can shoot again. The weapon is now ready to fire. It's essentially at safety right now at half cock. The weapon should not be capable physically of going off half cocked. Might be another saying you've heard before. So, weapon is then placed with the command make ready, or if you're continental, take aim. Cocking the weapon down, you're leveling the weapon, and you're firing. So if my friend from the 33rd wouldn't mind helping me, he's got a good crisp drill, familiar with the 1768. Take care, shoulder off, high lock. Never mind the fact that a colonial is giving commands to a Brit. Take care to prime and load. Prime and load. Right about face. Make ready. Present. What? Hold it off. Out. Right about face. Order. Well, folks, do we have any questions about the history of linear warfare, the militia systems, or the mechanics of 18th century warfare technology?
Too much like work.
Ah, you must have a fun job.
No, just loaded and fire.
Fair enough.
No ramrod used there, live.
Yeah, so he was following the reenactment drill. He did skip the use of the ramrod. That's a safety issue for modern American reenacting. In Europe, we still use ramrods for absolutely everything. One guy, one time, I won't say when or where or which unit, but I saw it. One guy, one time, left the ramrod in the barrel. and it came flying at us. And now we're all drilled not to use the ramrod anymore. Well, folks, if we don't have any further questions, I'll turn it over to Sergeant Mike of the 33rd Regiment of Foot. I'm sure he'd love to tell you more about the material culture of the British Army at the time.